welcome to Beginning Japanese class with Miss Steph Pedretti. This is a library program for the acknowledgement of January East Asian Heritage Month, which is the first month of the library's all-ages year-long humanities program entitled Creating Community Beyond Biases Library Resources. I would like to begin with the introduction of our teacher today. Stephanie Pedretti currently lives in Baroque, Wisconsin, where she maintains a private flute and recorder studio and is a music instructor at Pleasant Ridge Waldorf School. She holds a Bachelor of Music in Flute Performance from DePauw University and a Master's of Music in Flute Performance from Michigan State University in Lansing, Michigan. She graduated from the Talent Education Institute in Matsumoto, Japan. She has performed extensively both in the United States and abroad and recorded her debut CD as the recipient of a CAAP grant from the City of Chicago's Department of Cultural Affairs. Stephanie started learning Japanese language by taking a college class the year before she moved to Japan. She lived in Japan for 3 years, and that is where she did most of her study of the language. She went to Japan because of her interest and work with the Suzuki method of teaching music. She studied with Professor Toshio Takahashi. He is the flutist who applied the educational ideas of Shinichi Suzuki. She also taught English language in Japanese high schools as a participant in the Japan Exchange and Teaching Program. After returning to the United States, she lived in Chicago, where there was a large Japanese-speaking community, so she was able to participate in Japanese conversation groups and continue her study of the language. Now, Stephanie tutors at beginning and intermediate levels here in this area. If you are interested in tutoring or if you have further questions, you can contact Stephanie at her email address, which is stephaniepedrettimusic@zoho.com. Right, Stephanie, thank you so much for volunteering your time today, and you have our full attention, so whenever you'd like to begin.
Thank you, Lacey. Thanks to Library for hosting this introductory Japanese language class. So I was just going to talk a little more about my journey with Japanese before we dive into the class. So as Lacey mentioned in my introduction, I did spend 3 years in Japan. When I arrived there, I'd taken a full year of a college level Japanese class, but I stepped off the plane and felt like I didn't know anything because it is so different, you know, in real life in a foreign country to encounter the language than in the textbook classroom setting. And I also had these, ideas that just by being somewhere and being immersed with the language all around me, that it would maybe by osmosis kind of creep into my brain. But it takes a lot more, as you probably already know, it takes a lot more active work to really understand the language and work with it. So I did study the language actively while I was in Japan. Even after the 3 years, I wouldn't claim to be fully fluent in the language, but I did learn, a great deal. And I always I love the language, and I always love sharing it with people who are interested in the language. So just an overview, what I was thinking we'll do today is I'd like to give just some background about the language itself, just to understand it in general a little bit. We'll learn some common greetings and phrases, a little bit of counting. And if you actually, I don't know how much you all know, so we can certainly go a little further if you already have a little background yourselves. We'll talk a little bit about some resources for self-study of Japanese and language learning in general, and of course leave space for questions and question session Q&A at the end. If questions come up during the presentation, since we're such a small group, feel free to just kind of jump in if it's something that's specific to what I'm talking about at the time. Don't feel like you have to wait until the end. If you have your video on, I can just see your hand, or there's a little, I think there's that raise hand feature on here. Isn't there, Lacey, if someone wants to do that or use the chat? Oh, you're muted actually.
There we go. To address that question, yes, if you do have a question, you can put that right into the chat box. There is something called reactions also at the bottom of your screen. You can click on your name. I believe that also gives you the option to raise your hand. You can wave at the screen. There we go. Yeah, we're all present for everybody here.
All right. Great. So one thing that often comes up with the topic of Japanese is people think that it's a hard language, and maybe some of you have that impression. And I would say that it's not inherently hard. It's just very, very different from English. Japanese children, who are 5 years old, speak Japanese. English children in English speaking countries, when they're 5 years old, are speaking English. So it depends on what you're used to. But because it is so different from English, to give it some context, the US Department of State, the Foreign Service Institute, ranks languages by their difficulty. And Japanese is in there, for English speakers, it's in their most difficult category, which means that they estimate that to achieve what they call a level 3 proficiency, which is kind of a professional amount of proficiency in a language, it takes about 4 times longer to reach that level in Japanese than it would in a language like Spanish or French that's more closely related to English. And I am going to start a little bit of a slideshow here. If you give me just a second. Here it is. All right. And I just need to fix this a little bit so I can see everything I want to see. Okay. So I think these kind of things are fascinating. And there's lots of theories about the development of different languages around the world. And something interesting about Japanese is that it's considered a language isolate, which means that it doesn't seem to be part of a family tree with other languages. If we look at this big tree here, we can see this, it's all speculative, but there's this Indo-European, which has all these branches, and English is way off to one side. But if we see the Japanese over here, it has its own shoot. It's not part of any other tree. And that's another thing that makes it really different, is that it's, it seems to have developed in its own way like that. There are some grammatical similarities to Korean. And as we'll get into more in depth, the written language owes a lot to Chinese characters. A lot of vocabulary originated from China as well. But apart from that, the languages of Japanese and Chinese are really different. Grammatically, they're different. Structurally, pronunciation, just very, very different languages, apart from sharing those characters and some vocabulary. So speaking for myself, I did find there was a very steep learning curve when I first began learning Japanese, just because it is so different. And it feels like it takes a while. It's like climbing up this mountain until you get to a plateau where you first start feeling the results and you're able to use the language more functionally. So I would say, if you're interested in just getting started, don't give up at the beginning. It's going to probably be frustrating at the outset, but then once you get past that, kind of up over that first hill, then you start to feel more of the rewards, I think. Okay. So one of the first things I think you notice about Japanese is just how it looks. The language script is not anything we can read. It's not like a language like Spanish or Italian, where sometimes you can look at words and make guesses based on similarities to English, because the characters themselves are completely different. These just happen to all be pictures I found when I was looking back over my time in Japan that included Japanese writing. And in Japanese, there are 3 different scripts that are used. And if you count what they call Romaji, which is our Roman alphabet, there are even 4. And I found this page in a book I have that I thought was a perfect representation, because you can see all the different scripts that they use. So there are some of our letters. Rather than saying CD, it would sound like shidi in Japanese. These more complex characters are the kanji, which are the ones that come from China. There are phonetic characters that are more kind of scripty, curvy looking ones. Those are called hiragana, and those are purely phonetic. There are also phonetic characters that are called katakana, which represent even the same sounds as the hiragana, but they're only used for borrowed foreign words into Japanese. So we have our katakana here. You also will notice that there are no spaces. This writing is going vertically from top to bottom, right to left. no spaces whatsoever. It's just one thing follows the next. And having these 3 different kinds of scripts actually helps you find the borders between the words and know where to stop, where one word stops and the next one starts. That was actually one of my challenges when I first got beyond children's books in Japanese, was figuring out how many characters were a word and where did the word stop and where did the next word start, if I had to look something up in a dictionary that I didn't know. You can also write Japanese in the way that we do, from left to right. The vertical was the traditional way, and with more exposure to the West, this kind of writing also started to become more popular. So I just had this as an example here that you can also see the left to right. So I'll speak about kanji a little bit first. And some kanji come from the kanji, meaning the Chinese meaning-based characters. Some come from pictures originally, although if you see the final version, if you hadn't seen the progression, you might not know why does this look like a mountain? Excuse me. Or at first this square might not look like a rice field, but if you look at a progression from a more complex picture that got simplified and kind of made more angular, more square, then you can see these progressions from one thing to another, from a picture of a sun to a rectangle with a line that represents the sun or day, the moving person, here's a person, and this one means life. I don't know if these words got cut off, I'm not seeing them on my screen. And then some are a little more abstract, symbols for something being above or in the middle, large. It's like someone with their arms way out being big. So things like that. You can also take these kanji and make combinations, which become their own characters. So if we take the sun plus the moon and put them together, then it is a word that has or a character that has the meaning of being bright. A person and a tree is the idea is the person is resting beside the tree, and that is a vacation or a rest. So things like that. And then there are more complex versions as these parts get put together. My throat is very dry today. I'm not sure what happened. And just for fun, people always wonder how many strokes can you actually have in a kanji? And the answer is way too many. But within what's considered, there's about 2,000 of these Chinese characters that the government has determined in a list that everyone should know. And these are the ones that by the time you graduate from high school, you would know. I think it's maybe more like, 1900 something, but about 2,000. Those are the ones that the newspapers use. That's considered kind of a basic level of literacy. Within those 2,000 characters, this is the one that has the most strokes. There are 29 separate strokes in this character. And it's part of the use I know for it, it's part of the word for depression. And it might feel depressing to have to learn this many strokes to write something. There are certain kanji used in people's names that might have even more strokes, but this is the one I found that has the most strokes within what's considered the general use kanji. So as we're talking about the writing systems, a long time ago, the Chinese characters were brought from China to Japan. I can't remember quite what century that was. At the time, Japan did not have a written language at all. So at first they mapped the Chinese characters onto their language using them phonetically, but then that transitioned into using the Chinese characters for their meaning. And that is how one kanji character can have several different pronunciations. You can't look at a character and know how to say it if you don't have the context around it, like the sentence or the word that it's part of. And because Japanese is such a different language from Chinese, then the Japanese people gradually took elements from these characters and developed their phonetic alphabets, which are not truly alphabets. They're really considered syllabaries because each of those symbols represents a syllable, not just a sound like our English letters. And one interesting thing about hiragana, which we'll talk about next, is that it actually was developed by women originally, because the kanji was considered men's writing, these Chinese characters, and then the women developed this phonetic representation from the kanji into hiragana. And now everybody uses all the different forms, but that was the origin. So you'll see here what the hiragana look like on their own. Most children's books are written in hiragana with very little kanji or perhaps as they get older, some kanji, because this is the first set of characters that Japanese children learn. So that it's a great place for language learners to start is with the hiragana, because it is phonetic. There's a limited number of them, and that's kind of like a good pathway into getting used to reading these scripts that are so different from English. And along those lines, I would recommend anyone who has a serious interest in the language just to start as soon as you can with the hiragana and the different scripts. If you hang on to the romanization, looking at Japanese words with our alphabet, it'll really start holding you back. If you're just looking at like, I want to take a trip to Japan, I want to learn a few phrases and be able to talk, then in that case, you might not want to go to the effort of learning all the characters. But if you have an interest in the language in a more ongoing way, I think that the script is really important as well. The picture on the right is just a square I took from a manga. The fun thing about manga for language learners is that it has the kanji. I just need to move our faces so I can point at something here. So it has the kanji, but these little tiny symbols are hiragana that show you how to pronounce the kanji. Otherwise, looking at a word like this, you would not necessarily know how to say it. You wouldn't know that you say it nani. This is saying that you say nani. Or this is saying that this part of this word is pronounced oh. So that is really helpful kind of step along the way as you learn more. This is a set of the basic hiragana. I believe there are 46 of them. And the way they're arranged is, in this chart, is right to left, top to bottom, like the way Japanese writing tends to be. This is also Japanese alphabetical order, which took a while to wrap my mind around, that rather than A, B, C, D, E, F, G, we have A, I, U, E, O, Ka, Ki, Ku, Ke, Ko. So if you're looking in a dictionary, this is what you would find. I don't want to go necessarily through the whole chart, but I thought we could do a little bit of pronunciation practice of the hiragana. So I'll point and say and give you some time to say it in the comfort of your own home with your mute button on. So here we go. A, I, U, E, O, Ka, Ki, Ku, Ke, Ko, Sa, Shi, Su, Se, So, Ta, Chi, Su. That one can be a little tricky for English speakers because there's a T and then an S immediately afterward. This is how you would truly say a word like tsunami. It's not tsunami. There's that T at the beginning. Tsu. Te, to. And that gives you the idea. You can keep going. And you'll see with most of these consonant sounds, you get each of the different vowel sounds attached to it. The exception here being with the Y sounds, ya, you, and yo. From what I understand, old Japanese had a few sounds that modern Japanese no longer uses. These that are written with an R, the sound is truly in between an English R and L. It's not exactly one or the other, and an L will give you a closer sound to the Japanese than thinking of it as an R. And then here is our one exception. You might have noticed that every one of these has a vowel sound in it, either just a vowel or a consonant plus vowel. This one sounds like and it's considered its own syllable. So if you learn these, then you've got your basic set of hiragana, your syllabary. That word is hard for me to say for some reason. And then there are modifications that we can do to those basic characters to create different sounds. I'm going to look at the bottom of this first, and there are sounds that are considered voiced and unvoiced. For example, if you put your hand at where your voice box is on your throat, if you say ka, you won't feel a lot of vibration. If you say ga, you'll feel a little more happening there. So when your voice box is, I don't know how to explain it technically, but when your voice box is more engaged, it creates these what are considered voiced sounds. So rather than having a completely different character for the voiced version of that sound, ka and ga, they just add these 2 little lines that are called a dakuten, and that tells you to say ga instead of ka. So you don't actually have to learn as many different characters that way. You just have to learn this one symbol that modifies the characters. So for example, here we have ga, gi, gu, ge, and go. We can do the same thing with the Z sound, or the D sound, da. And then these are a little bit different. We take the original sound was ha. If you add those 2 little lines, it becomes ba. We get a B sound at the beginning of these words. If you add a little circle instead, which is called a han dakuten for some reason, I'm not sure why, we get a P sound for pa, pi, pu, pe, po. And then just briefly, we'll look at all of these. So these are often called glides. It's just putting 2 sounds together. So when you see this kya, it's not ki, ya, it's 1 syllable, that's kya, kya. And we can do that with a lot of the different hiragana, and that's where the rest of these sounds come from. So the best place to start is with that basic set, because once you know those, then you can modify them a bit, and you've got all the sounds you need to speak Japanese, and you know how to read them. And then once you've learned that, we get to do it all over again with katakana. So it seems a little redundant. But when you're reading the language, it actually does help you, like I was saying, to see the different words, and it conveys meaning. But when you first approach the language, you think, I just learned all 46 hiragana and all the variations, and now you're telling me I have to do it all over again. And yes, then you get to do it all over again. So I won't go through all of the katakana with you. If you are in Japan and you go to something like a Western restaurant, you'll be able to read a menu to a large degree if you can read katakana, because all the borrowed words are in katakana. Not that you necessarily want to eat at a Western restaurant in Japan, you probably want to eat at a Japanese restaurant, but it is a really, really also useful set of characters to learn. Let's see. Oh yeah, the one thing I was going to mention that didn't really come up in these charts and talking about pronunciation is that stroke order is a really important concept in writing Japanese characters. And in school here as well, we learn a certain way of writing our letters, but probably most of us as we become adults kind of do it freestyle. And to some degree, you can do that in Japanese as well. But every character has a certain direction and a certain order in which you draw the strokes. So if you were to learn to write the hiragana or the katakana, I'll give you some resources at the end, but you would want to find either a workbook or a website of some sort that shows you that stroke order. It becomes even more important in the Chinese characters, the kanji, because if you want to look up kanji in a traditional dictionary, you actually look them up by the number of strokes. Since yeah, there's all kinds of fun like apps and online things that make it way easier than in the old days. But traditionally, Japanese kanji dictionaries are organized like 1-stroke characters, 2-stroke characters, etc. And if you don't know how many strokes are in a character, if you're just kind of guessing how to draw it, then you might not know how to look it up by the strokes, the number of strokes. Another thing that's interesting about the pronunciation of Japanese, these 2 phonetic syllabaries, katakana and hiragana, are completely regular. It's not like English where an A can sound like ah, or like cat, or it could sound like bake. It can become that, it does all kinds of different things. A ka in Japanese is always a ka. A sa is always a sa. When you see this, you see it, you know it. So that's an aspect of it that is much, much easier than English pronunciation for non-native speakers. There are just a very, very few exceptions when they're used in certain grammatic ways of the hiragana, but for the most part, you can just take it, you see it, you've got it. Long vowels in Japanese are literally longer vowels, which is a different idea than in English. When we have short vowels and long vowels, they change sound. So a long O in Japanese is not changing its sound. It's just, instead of O, it's O for a longer time. So the pronunciation of Japanese is very regular. It's almost like you can have a beat to it. Because I'm a musician, I would actually practice saying words and kind of tapping like I had a metronome, so I would get the syllables properly. And one example I like to use for that is I was at a music conference once in Japan, and I was watching a video of an early childhood music class. And just like we do here, sometimes we use words with different numbers of syllables to teach subdivisions of the beat. And we might use the word watermelon for 4 notes in the beat, like 16th notes. They were using the word orange, which is 1 syllable in English. But when you take the borrowed word orange into Japanese, it becomes oranji. It actually has 4 syllables. And so to make a word sound like the word it truly is, you need to know if you're long vowel, it needs to be twice as long as a short vowel and things like that. So it's just a different kind of set of rules than we have around pronunciation. We're not going to really study grammar today, but I'm just going to kind of touch on some of the differences or similarities between Japanese and English grammar. Something that makes Japanese verbs easier than other languages we might learn is they don't change for the number or the person. Like English and other Romance languages change even more than English, with the verbs between different things. So this tabemasu, that could be I eat. It could be she eats, he eats, they eat. It's all tabemasu. It doesn't matter who is doing the eating or how many people are doing the eating. And this is the word to eat. And in the non-past, this could be either present or future. So if I say watashi wa, meaning me, watashi wa tabemasu, it could mean I eat, or it could mean I will eat if there was context that let you know that that's something that's happening later. And another interesting thing about Japanese grammar is a verb by itself. This is just the verb eat. That can be a complete sentence. You don't need to say I. If it's obvious I'm talking about myself, I just say tabemasu. And you know that I'm saying I eat. I don't have to say the word I. This is just the negative. So instead of saying I don't eat or he doesn't eat, we put the negation at the end. So rather than the sound of tabemasu, we say tabemasen. And I should mention these are all just the basic polite version of these verbs. There are more casual and even more polite versions, but this is kind of your basic generic level of politeness. And to go into past tense, it's similar to English in that we change the ending of a verb. So I ate, or he ate, she ate, tabemashita. So our mas goes to mashita. You don't have to memorize all this. I don't expect you to. It's just kind of an introduction to the idea of how the language works. If you want to say I didn't eat, or they didn't eat, or here's our word eat, it becomes tabemasen deshita. And that is the negative past tense. And I just threw this last one here as an example of, I find there's lots of situations where in English we use auxiliary verbs or helping verbs, and those don't exist in Japanese, but there are lots of different endings that we can put on the verb instead to create different meanings. So this one means want to eat. And this one I only would use with myself because I wouldn't presume to know if you want to eat or not. So I'd use a different word if I thought maybe you want to eat. But if I know I want to eat, I would say tabetai desu. So it's all this one word with a different ending. So I find this endlessly fascinating, all the things you can do with Japanese verbs. Another thing that makes Japanese grammar very different from English is the word order. The word order in Japanese is more flexible than the order of English, but the one basic rule is the verb always goes to the end. So this sentence in English, we would say I ate an apple. In Japanese, I would say watashi wa ringo o tabemashita. So I'm saying I, and this is pronounced actually wa. This is one of our very few exceptions to the hiragana pronunciation rules. That marks this word as the topic of the sentence. We have these, I got myself a little bit out of order because I was going to mention that in Japanese, the function of a word in a sentence is indicated by a part of speech called a particle. And particles can only be used attached to a word because they don't have any meaning really by themselves. And once you get used to the idea of particles, they're really, really useful because then it tells you, for example, here, that apple, as soon as I see ringo o, I hear that o, I know that that's the direct object of the sentence. So whatever's happening is happening to the apple. I ate the apple. And that comes at the end, the verb. Let's see, a few other things I was going to mention. These are things that actually make Japanese a little easier. Japanese has no articles like an, or the. So that's one whole category you don't have to worry about. And so it's not like learning a language like French or Spanish that has gender. There's none of that stuff. No articles whatsoever. Nouns generally don't have a plural form. So this could actually be apple or apples. It's usually, you understand it from the context. So you don't have to learn plurals and irregular plurals and things like that. There are some words you can put a plural on, but oftentimes there's no plural. And another thing that's really important to know about Japanese is that there are various levels of politeness. And the type of words I'm using here are this kind of like usual adult level of politeness amongst people that you maybe don't know very well, or you're working, and that's kind of the best place to start because that's the kind of language you can use with anybody. And then as you get more proficient, you would learn ways, if you were speaking to someone who is considered like a higher status, you'd use humble language about yourself and more kind of honorific language about that person. If you're speaking with close friends, there's a more casual version of all the things we've been saying here that you would use amongst friends, or perhaps, other people you're close to that are around your age. So that's something that, of course, in English, we have levels of politeness, but it's just expressed grammatically in Japanese and with certain vocabulary and in ways that we don't do it in English. So that's a topic that kind of is its whole own topic. And now we're on to the point where we get to speak some Japanese. And if you have some interest in the language, some of these phrases are basic enough that you may have come across them already, but I thought it was a good place to start with just basic greetings and things like that. So we'll go from number 1 here. This is, as you can see, what you would say to someone in the morning. There's not really a word that's just hello, like we say in hi or hello. It's based on the time of day. I'm sorry, just a moment. All right, so I'll go ahead and say this and you can say it back to me. Ohayo gozaimasu.
Gozaimasu.
Hi. Ohayo gozaimasu.
Ohayo gozaimasu.
Great. And if you want a shorter casual version of this one, you can just say Ohayo. And that's how friends could greet each other. If you want to be more polite, you add the gozaimasu. And this word you'll see coming up a lot, this polite ending. We'll encounter it a few other places as well, even today. I do have a funny story, digression, from a friend of mine who was Japanese and had a homestay. I don't remember where she was at the time. I think she was in Michigan, but she was talking, she first got there and her host's mom wanted to say something to her in Japanese. She said, well, you can, the easiest word to learn is Ohio for good morning, because it's just like the state of Ohio. And the next morning, my friend comes down for breakfast and her host mom says, Iowa. So just remember, which state do you want to say in the morning? All right, so we have good morning, Ohayo gozaimasu. Then we move into the middle of the day and you would say konnichiwa.
Konnichiwa.
Great, and you caught me saying this long N sound here, right? So this is one of those spaces where that N is its whole syllable, konnichiwa.
Konnichiwa.
And I was going to mention, like, the literal meanings of these words are kind of interesting because Ohayo gozaimasu literally means it's early. And this just means in a very polite way with the gozaimasu. Konnichiwa literally means today. And from what I hear, it came from a longer phrase that got shortened. So when you say konnichiwa, literally you're just saying as for today when you meet someone. And the same thing with konbanwa. It just basically means this evening. And that's what you say to someone in the evening. So we'll try that one. Konbanwa.
Konbanwa.
And then there are a lot of set phrases in Japanese that are things that you traditionally say in a certain situation. And a lot of them don't translate really well, literally, to English. This one is, you'll hear every time you sit down to a meal in Japan, everyone will say itadakimasu. Itadakimasu.
Itadakimasu.
And this is the one I have the most fun mnemonic for. It sounds a lot like if you say, eat a duck, I must. And if you say that quickly, eat a duck, I must, it almost sounds like itadakimasu.
Itadakimasu.
Yeah, so this is one that you'll hear and want to know if you ever go to Japan, because anytime you sit down to eat, you'll want to say this. Literally, it means I receive, and it's a humble version of that word. So it's showing appreciation in that you're acknowledging, what you're receiving to eat. And this is what you would say after you eat: gochiso sama.
Gochiso sama.
Right. And that literally means something like it was a feast. And it doesn't matter if it was a small or a large amount of food, but it's an expression of appreciation of the food that you ate. And this is kind of a nice example of how there can be quite a variety of casual to polite versions of an expression that you might say. These are all ways to say thank you. And in most of them, you'll see this word arigato, which is pretty familiar even to people who don't know Japanese, this word arigato. Or if you're with the right generation, domo arigato, Mr. Roboto. So we have arigato. To make it the most common, politer version that you'll hear people say is arigato gozaimasu. And that's that same gozaimasu that we heard with the Ohayo gozaimasu. So I'll say this one and leave you a space to say it yourself. Arigato gozaimasu.
Arigato gozaimasu.
Great. And if you want to make it even more polite, you can add a domo, which in this case means very, like thank you very much. Domo arigato gozaimasu.
Domo arigato gozaimasu.
What you'll hear the most, arigato gozaimasu.
Arigato gozaimasu.
Combine these two, domo arigato.
Domo arigato.
And then this one should feel pretty easy by now after all those long ones. Arigato.
Arigato.
This is very casual. Domo.
Domo.
I know when to use the more casual version. All right. And then another really, really useful word in Japanese is sumimasen, because this one word is so all-purpose. If you want to catch someone's attention, like the picture here is showing someone with a menu at a restaurant, sumimasen. Yeah, go ahead. Yeah, sumimasen.
Sumimasen.
It also can mean I'm sorry. Sumimasen. It can mean thank you, with the idea maybe it's, like maybe in English we'd say, oh, you didn't have to do that. It's sorry for taking the trouble, like that kind of feeling. And it can even, I haven't heard it used this way as often, but it can even mean just if you didn't hear someone, you want to say, sorry, pardon, I didn't hear you, sumimasen. So this is one of those words that will serve you well once you learn that word. It's always nice to learn some numbers, I think, in a language, and that usually comes really early on. And Japanese numbers are interesting. These are considered where they say Kango. These are Chinese origin numbers. The Wago are the Japanese pronunciation origin. So both very common in different contexts. This is usually what you learn first if you're learning. It's just, and if you're just counting, this is what you would say, ichi, ni, san, shi. And we'll go through them a little more slowly in a moment. If you're actually talking about how many of an item you have, there is another part of speech called a counter, which is absolutely essential in Japanese. In English, we have some counters, but we don't need to have them for everything. For example, we would talk about, oh, I have 3 sheets of paper. So you wouldn't just say, I have 3 papers. You say, I have three sheets of paper. Or I have 1 glass of water. So there are situations that we use that kind of phrasing. In Japanese, it's like that all the time. So you get to learn a whole bunch of different counters. And the categories can be very interesting for non-native speakers, just the way that different kinds of objects are grouped together. But that is its own topic as well. So I won't go there too far there right now, but you can ask more at the end if you want. So we can just go through and do a little bit of basic counting. Ichi, it's kind of easy to remember because it's like ichi. Yeah, and then we have ni. So if you think about having an itchy knee, you've got your first two numbers there. Ichi, ni, san, shi, go, roku, shichi, hachi, kyu, ju. And that takes you 1 through 10. And the great thing about Japanese numbers is they are so predictable and regular. When you get past 10, 11 is just saying, you just say 10, 1, ju, ichi, ju, ni, 10, 2, 10, 3. And then if you want to say 20, you just put the 2 before the 10, ni, ju. So you're saying 2, 10. 21 is like saying 2, 10, 1, ni, ju, ichi. And it works like that just perfectly regularly all the way up to 100, which is really, really nice. I think back to learning French, 80 is something like 420s. And, and I can't remember anymore how to count in French. Then when you get past 100, it's basically the same pattern. There's some pronunciation shifts, but the pattern holds true. An interesting thing is that when you get into really large numbers, there's a word for 1,000, sen. Then the next interval is 10,000. So the counting is you have the idea of having 1 10,000. Ichiman means basically literally 1 10,000. And which it takes a while to get used to if you're like hearing people talk about prices and things like that. So instead of saying like, 10,000, and you will hear that because 1 yen in Japanese is like about a penny approximately. So you do get into these large numbers when you're counting money. Ichiman, niman, like 1 10,000, 2 10,000s. And that does take some getting used to. Let's see. I think, yeah, that is pretty much the end of my slideshow. I just thought this was cute at the end, and I'll tell you what this says. It says Ganbatte, and literally it means like do your best. So as we progress into Japanese, I'll tell, and it's meant as like an encouragement. Instead of saying good luck to someone, like we would say good luck. In Japan, they would say Ganbatte. So I'll share that to all of you. Ganbatte. Let's see, I'm going to go ahead and stop the slide share. Oh, and I need just a moment before I can see all of you again, the way my computer is set up. Okay, now I can see everybody again. So I was just going to open up here, Lacey, for any questions.
Yes,
yeah.
absolutely. Well, a round of applause for Stephanie and her wonderful presentation. I don't think I'm alone in being absolutely blown away and fascinated right now and intrigued. And I feel like I've learned so much from you in these past 40 minutes. Stephanie, I did not know that there were these 3 different alphabets, but one is not exactly an alphabet. It really helped me answer a question that I've always had when I've been looking at Japanese language and wondering, is this or is this not? I didn't understand that there were these 3 different forms that all combine into an overall understanding of written Japanese language, at least. So that was absolutely fascinating. We do have a question coming in. When do you use the other way to pronounce the numbers? So you had gone over the ones that we saw on our screen on the left side, and then there's also the ones that are on the right side.
Yeah, it goes along with the idea of counters. So when you're counting certain things, you'll use certain pronunciations. If you're counting people, one person, it's not ichi would be the number on the left that we read through together. Ichi nin would be like the logical thing you think you would say, but actually you say hitori, like the hito is the pronunciation from the right side numbers, or futari is 2 people. If you're counting like kind of generic small things, you count hitotsu, futatsu, mitsu, yotsu, using those pronunciations from the right. There are other places that come into play as well. So it just all depends on what kind of thing that you're counting. And those Japanese origin numbers, for the most part, only go up through the number 10. And once you get above 10, you always are using these Chinese origin numbers, which were the ones that we were talking about in more depth.
Okay.
So feel free to ask farther, Gabriella, if there was more, if you wanted to go any more in depth on that question.
I also wanted to circle back around to when you were at the beginning, you showed a children's book, and it was using the second grouping of language. I'm sorry, could you, it's the phonetic.
Yeah.
Phonetic. Is that read from left to right or from right to left?
That is read from left to right or from top to bottom. So in any of the scripts, it doesn't matter which one it is, you have a choice of going vertically. And when you're doing vertical, it's top to bottom, right to left.
Okay.
When you're going horizontal, it's always left to right, top to bottom.
Left to right, top to bottom.
Yeah. And you might notice too with that the children's book, you actually will see spaces. It's almost impossible to read hiragana without kanji and other characters without spaces. Because there are so many homonyms in Japanese because there's more limited number of sounds than in some languages. So you'll encounter one pronunciation that could mean so many different things, and having the different script types actually helps you in the written language to know which meaning that you're using. And like I was saying before, it helps you find the word boundaries. So in children's books using just hiragana, you will see spaces between the words.
Okay, that makes sense. So I do know that the library and Winding River's library system, we own bilingual Katakana books. So in theory, if we were to print out a sheet of hiragana, if we were to print that out and then we could see each letter.
It's fine to call them a letter, I think, just for general purposes. Yeah.
So then if we could see the pronunciation of each letter character, we'd be able to look at this book and be able to at least pronounce and read Japanese. And then on the other page is the English translation. So I could see that being a really great library resource for learning beginning Japanese language. Would you agree, Stephanie?
Yeah, I would. That's definitely a good way to, especially for the reading, to get started. I think that at the same time, you probably want to be doing some kind of grammar self-study, whether that was through a textbook or some other resource, because until you know the word order and how it works in Japanese, the English translation, if it's written to sound natural in English, it's not going to map exactly onto the Japanese that you just read. So you can't think like, oh, this first word here must mean bird because it says bird in English. So you couldn't really like go word for word like that with one of those books, but an excellent resource for the pronunciation and getting familiar with the hiragana. I would agree.
Yeah, fantastic. Those books would be available in the youth section, which we actually call the everybody section. So I think that could, and they look like they're very nice books with lots of illustration and different subject matters as well.
This tofugu.com is a really fun website. It's got just lots of fun articles about different aspects of the language. And there is one post where they review several of the popular textbooks and things. If you're looking for more of just like organized, like I want to have a real book textbook to, learn step by step, which I think is a very good way to go. There are online resources where you can do kind of similar work online. This is a website from a Japanese school in Tokyo, I think it is, where they have a lot of free learning materials if you scroll down far enough. People always talk about Japanese Pod. I haven't actually used it myself so much, but I wanted to put it on there because it's really popular and it seems to be well received. This JapaneseAmmo.com, I guess it gives you your language ammunition to survive in Japan. There's a Japanese woman named Misa who's a Japanese teacher, and she has just tons of videos where you can, if you like to have someone teach to you like that, you could watch their videos. This one is a site that it's just pretty well organized, just going through lessons for self-study. This is the kind of thing you'd want if you want to learn how to write out the hiragana. If you go to this website, it gives you pretty detailed instructions. There's printables where you can, have a practice sheet. And I'll just show you what's typical. I don't have one for hiragana, but it's pretty much the same in hiragana. I'll stop sharing here because then you won't be able to see what I'm holding. So you'll find that you'll have a character. I don't know if you can see this well enough. It might be kind of blurry. And there's a whole bunch of boxes and it shows you one by one how to add the strokes. And then you have lots of practice space. And you'll find this for hiragana, for katakana, for kanji as a way to practice writing and learning the characters. And there was also a couple of YouTube links at the bottom of that list that I didn't get to before I stopped the screen share, but there's a lot of YouTube channels. I just put a few up there that have helpful lessons in learning Japanese.
And thank you, Stephanie, for the nice introduction. Thanks, Lacey, for hosting all this. could you just talk a little bit, Stephanie, about the structure of the class moving forward? How long it is, how many weeks we're going to go, and
Oh, this actually was just like a one shot, like, are you interested in learning about like the introduction to the Japanese language? This is kind of like a one shot deal from the library just to kind of put it out there, like, yeah.
Oh, okay. I had no idea. I had no
Okay.
idea. So that gives you some perspective. So this is not an ongoing class.
It is not. I do a small amount of private tutoring and things like that on my so feel free to contact me if you have further questions or if that's something that you might be interested in.
I wanted to say to those who are watching at home that if you do happen to be interested in the library being able to consider hosting more beginning Japanese language classes, if you would please email me at my email address, which is the letter L period Sheldon at WRLSWEB.org. Again, that's the letter L period Sheldon at WRLSWEB.org. And I will respond to you and see if there's any way that your library can assist you in your educational language pursuits as well.
Great.
Fabulous. So fantastic. I know that I've learned a lot and I'm certainly intrigued. Are there any other final remarks or questions? Gabriella is saying, thank you so much, Stephanie.
You're welcome.
Domo arigato gozaimasu.
Doitashimashite.
I also wanted to say that to you as well. Domo arigato gozaimasu.
Doitashimashite. I'm just saying you're welcome in Japanese. Or an easier thing that people often say is it's kind of like saying, oh, it was nothing or no problem, is iie, which is literally saying no. So if someone says thank you, you can just say iie, like no problem.
Very good. Thank you, Stephanie. And we want to also send out our few gratitudes here to Vernon Communications Cooperative for assisting us in making these programs available on Vernon Communications Cooperative's community channel number 14 as well. This is a presentation for Creating Community Beyond Biases Library Resources. That's the library's year-long all-ages humanities program. This is the first month of January East Asian Heritage Month. And we're so very thankful again, Stephanie. For more information, you can contact myself at the library. Stephanie is also open for questions and comments at her own email address, which is Stephanie Pedretti Music at Zoho.com. That's ZOHO.com. Thanks everyone and have such a nice day.
Arigato.
Arigato.